Hello! So today I want to talk to you a little bit about getting your quilt ready for a long arm quilter. So if you don't know, I do long arm quilt, and I do have a mom who's an award-winning long armer, and I've been around long arms for a very long time. So I wanted to go ahead and highlight a few things that would be good for you to know when getting your quilt ready for your long armer. One of the biggest things is making sure your seams are really well pressed and that all your threads are trimmed. So that will help the quilt lay nice and flat. It'll avoid getting tucks and wrinkles in your quilt because when the long armor loads it on the frame is very unforgiving. You'll see every kind of mistake that was made in the quilt. So pressing your seams flat will help that a lot. So one of the most important things that you can do to avoid those rumples and tweaks in your quilt is to perfect your 1/4 inch seam. So that's going to help a lot. So if you're struggling with your 1/4 inch seam, I would suggest trying different feet for your machine. It's a little bit of a cheaper way to figure out if it's the machine or if it's you or if it's your foot, because sometimes we tend to vary which way we sew. I tend to sew this way. My stitches go down and around, so I have to be really careful to make sure that when I reach the end of a seam, I make sure I tweak it just a little bit, and it usually ends up straight. Usually, because we're human. So that is a really good way to make sure that your tweaks and rumples are less and less in your quilts, is to just perfect that 1/4 inch seam. Another thing to do is to make sure your backing is prepared. And if you are piecing your backing, I suggest doing a 1/2 inch seam and pressing it open. That'll help eliminate the bulk of the seam. But when you do sand in your backing and when you do sand in your quilt, you do want to make sure that your backing is larger than your top. So when I ask for a quilt, I always ask for it to be 4 inches larger on the backing, to be 4 inches larger on every side. So if your quilt is 60 by 60, you want to make sure you have a backing that's 68 by 68. That way the long armer has room to pin your backing onto the leader, which is a piece of cloth that's wrapped around usually the pole and helps pull in the quilt. And there's room on the sides for the clamps, because long arm quilters use big clamps to hold the fabric taut while they quilt. If you don't have a big enough backing, it can cause maybe a little extra stretch in your quilt. It can cause the pinning to go a little bit awry, maybe into your quilt, and we can't get the actual quilting, the stitching, all the way to the edges of your quilt. So it's really good to have that extra backing fabric. Backing with borders, it's nearly impossible to line those borders up. I recently was given a custom quilt with panels, and she asked me to put borders on each side, and I had to let her know I'd be happy to do that, but as I load it onto the machine, it may not line up perfectly. We can get it close, but it's going to be really hard to line that up perfectly because of the extra space we need and the way you just can't see it when you load it on. So keep that in mind. If you want to put borders on your backing, it might be a little bit tough to get that really lined up well. And you do have backing options. So the best is 108 inch, pretty simple, no seams, easy for you, easy for the long armor. But there are other ways to do backing. You can buy the regular 42 or 40 inch bolt fabric and piece it. You can also get minky. Long armers are okay with minky. Most. Check with your long armor. Most are okay with minky, but you want to try to avoid fleece. Fleece is a little bit difficult to work with because of how thick it is. So we have a lot of tension issues sometimes as long arm quilters with fleece. So keep that in mind. A flannel is also a great option if you want something warm and snuggly and soft. I love flannel. I use a lot of flannel in my quilting. So we also have, when you're quilting, when you long arm quilt, you tend to go all the way to the edge. Some long armors, if they're custom quilting, they'll leave the border open to puff because that's a nice detail to add. But when you're computerized quilting, a lot of quilters will quilt all the way off the edge. So there's another reason why you want a little more backing. That way, when it goes off the edge, it'll quilt into the batting and the backing, and then we just trim it on the edge. And if you are considering rolling over your backing to make your binding, please tell your long arm quilter because they might go over the edges. So if they need to know. So if you want to roll over that backing, tell your long arm quilter. That way they can prepare for cutting off their stitching right on the edge for you. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're going to add embellishments, it's better to wait till after the quilt is quilted. So embellishments like buttons, beads, anything like that, rhinestones, it's a little bit easier because when the machine is moving, either if it's computerized, you'd have to work around it. A lot of needles and feet aren't big enough or skinny enough to get close to those embellishments, so it might risk breaking the needle and ruining the pattern that's being stitched. So you don't want to baste your quilt before you give it to a long armer. The way a long arm machine works is that you actually load each piece of the quilt on as you go. So the backing usually is the first one, and then the batting, and then the top. So the long arm actually does the basting part pretty much for us as long arm quilters. So that's great. Batting is a preference. So a lot of quilters have 100% batting, 100% cotton batting, and they have 80-20 batting, which is 80% cotton, 20% polyester. But there are an array of different kinds of battings. If you want, there is a great research on that, and I do offer a class, and part of the class that I offer in my domestic quilting goes really into batting. So if you want more information on all the different kinds of batting, it's a great class to take. But batting is preferable depending on the loft, depending on the type of quilt you're making, because t-shirt quilts are going to need something a little bit different than 100% cotton quilts. So make sure you do your research on your batting. When you bring your quilt to your long armor, you also want to make sure that the batting you bring is larger than your quilt, just like the backing. I always ask for 4 inches of batting as well. That gives me space to practice to make sure my tension is perfect, and it gives me space to quilt all the way over the edge. That way I can complete the row on the computerized quilting, or it gives me a little bit of wiggle room if I need a little extra practice with the tension for my free motion quilting. So make sure you also have a batting that is bigger than your top. I've actually had a king size quilt brought to me with queen size batting. So measure your top and make sure your backing and batting are larger than your top. What's great about using a long armor is that you can just give an idea of what you're thinking you want in your quilt and they can run with it. So it is really nice to have a simple idea of what you want quilted in your quilt. So if you want something flowy, if you want something more modern, if you want straight lines, if you want waves because it's an ocean theme, if you want cute little animals because it's a baby quilt, it's great to tell your long arm quilter kind of an idea of what you have, and she'll usually, or they will usually tell you what they have available. So that's really handy for your long arm quilter to have, or for you to tell your long arm quilter so they can prepare for that. One of the biggest problems that I've personally seen is that borders have been put on a little bit wrong. So the best way that I have found to put a border on a quilt to keep the quilt square is to start from the middle and sew to the end. And then again, start from the middle of the quilt and sew to the end. It's really tempting just to stick it on the corner and sew all the way down, but that will push, because when we sew, it pushes the fabric just slightly, and after that long of a way, it's going to tweak your quilt. So your quilt, instead of staying square, how you made it, it might tweak a little bit. I was looking for an example. I don't have one to hold. But that is a really good way to help keep your quilt square when you add borders. Just sew from the middle. And what I do is I use the top of the model first. So I will sew my border to the top from the middle out, from the middle out. And then the bottom from the middle out, middle out. I'll trim the edges, then I'll do the sides. From the middle all the way down, the middle all the way up, all the way down, all the way up. And that will keep your quilt much more square. And it'll stop the borders from, or it'll prevent the borders, hopefully, from doing that rumple. Have you ever seen the rumple? It's really obvious when you get it on a quilting long arm frame. When you start to pin it, you can really see it come out. Like I said, when you load that quilt onto the frame, it's going to show every twerk and tweak. I made a word. Tweak in your quilt top. So it's really good to put those borders on correctly. And if you need an extra video for that for another mini lesson, let me know. I'd be happy to make one. I do make lots of borders, or lots of quilts with borders. Your Longarmer will thank you so much for having everything ready for them. You might be their favorite customer. So follow these guidelines. I hope this helps. I would love to write this out for you and have a sheet for you down below. And feel free to download it. And I'll make it a cute little checklist because I love my checklist. I hope this video is valuable to you. I hope it makes it easier to prepare your quilt for your Longarmer and gives you something to focus on. If you would like to suggest another mini lesson, let me know in the comments below and I would be happy to supply you with some more information. Have a great day.